My husband filed for divorce before our daughter's wedding, but I already had every asset document ready. Margaret Holloway described the morning of her daughter's wedding in a particular way. She said it felt, from the moment she woke up, like standing at the edge of something she had poured herself into completely. 14 months of work, 14 months of vendor negotiations, floor plan revisions, catering decisions, florist arguments, hotel room blocks, timeline adjustments, and the 100 small corrections that no one at the wedding would ever know had been made. The wedding was a $980,000 event, not because anyone in the family was careless about money, but because the guest list was large, the venue was formal, and Margaret had built her career as a private event planner for 14 years. She knew how to do this. She had done it for other people's families dozens of times. This time it was her daughter, and she had put everything she knew into it. She did not hire someone else to plan it. She was the planner. She had a separate coordinator for the day of operations, a woman named Claire, who had worked with Margaret professionally and understood that Margaret would still be present and still be watching. Margaret was not the kind of person who handed something over and walked away. She had a printed timeline in her jacket pocket and a backup in the glove box of her car. She had Claire's cell number and the venue manager's cell number and every vendor's cell number saved under their first and last names. She arrived at the venue before 6 in the morning. The sky was still pale when she pulled into the parking lot. She sat in the car for a moment, not out of hesitation, but because she had learned years ago that you do not walk into a venue on the day of an event without first running the full timeline in your head from start to finish. She did that. Every vendor, every arrival window, every contingency she had planned for. Then she got out of the car. The florists were already there, working through the centerpieces. The linen service had completed the table coverings on the east side, but not yet the west. The lighting crew was finishing the rigging above the main hall. Margaret walked the room. She checked the table configurations against the diagram she had drawn by hand 3 weeks earlier. She spoke to the head florist about a centerpiece element that was running lower than planned. The eucalyptus was thinner on the high arrangements. They adjusted. She checked the bridal suite and confirmed that her daughter's dress, which had been delivered the evening before, was hanging correctly and undisturbed. She had been inside the venue for about 40 minutes when she went back out to the loading dock to bring in the final boxes. The florist had called ahead the previous evening to say that the cocktail table arrangements were being delivered in 2 separate runs, and that the second run, the smaller boxed pieces for the foyer and the terrace, would need to be carried in on the morning of the event. Margaret had said she would handle it. That was the kind of thing she always said she would handle, and always did. She was at the loading dock, lifting boxes, when the process server appeared. He came through the service entrance, and he asked her by name if she was Margaret Holloway. She set the boxes down. He handed her the envelope. She looked at it for a moment, then she opened it. She read the first page. She folded it back in half. She picked her boxes back up. She walked inside and finished unloading the car. Some people plan the wedding. Some people plan the exit. There were 3 trips from the car to the loading dock. She made all 3. She stacked the boxes in the staging area, and she spoke briefly to the florist about the foyer placement. And only then, when the car was fully unloaded and the last box was inside, did she find a quiet corner near the service entrance and read the full filing. She was not a lawyer, but she had read enough legal documents over 22 years to understand what she was holding. She had always read them in full, even the ones that did not seem important, because she had learned early in her event planning career that the clause that matters is almost never the one anyone warns you about. You read everything. You understand what you are agreeing to, or in this case, what is being done to you. She read every page, twice. Richard's attorney had filed for divorce in Davidson County, on grounds of irreconcilable differences. That alone, she said later, was not what stopped her breath. Marriages end. She had known, somewhere she had not fully named, that this one was in the process of ending. But attached to the divorce petition was an emergency motion, a request to freeze $6,200,000 in marital assets pending the outcome of the proceedings. She read the motion carefully, twice. The freeze, if granted, would lock Margaret out of the family's investment accounts. It would place a hold on the primary residence. It would restrict access to the two commercial properties, one on Concord Street and the Millhaven property on Eastern Pike. And it would do all of this before Margaret could pay the vendor invoices due the day after the wedding. The catering balance, the florals, the lighting and audio, the venue final payment, everything she had contracted to pay on Monday. She stood there with the filing in her hands and the wedding photograph she had tucked into the inside pocket of her jacket that morning. She had found it 2 weeks earlier when she and her daughter were going through a memory box. A photograph from Margaret and Richard's own wedding, taken more than 2 decades ago. Her daughter had laughed at Margaret's hair and said she wanted to keep it. Margaret had said she would make a copy. She had carried the original with her since, meaning to get it scanned. She had not yet. She looked at the photograph for a moment. The woman in it was 29 years old. She was laughing at something slightly off camera, and she looked entirely like someone who had no idea what the next 22 years would contain. Which was, of course, true. Margaret studied it for a few seconds. She thought about the morning that photograph had been taken. She thought about what she had known then, and what she did not know then, and what she knew now. That was not the clause they should have worried about. The clause they should have worried about was the one that said Margaret Holloway had kept every financial document the family had ever generated, had updated the records every year without fail, and had an attorney who already had all of it on file before any of this began. She put the photograph back in her pocket, walked through the service door, and called her attorney from the parking lot. His name was David Crane. He had been representing Margaret for 6 years. Their relationship had started not with a divorce, but with estate planning. Margaret had come to him to set up the family's estate documents, wills, beneficiary designations, property arrangements. She had brought records with her to that first meeting that had surprised him. Records going back to the first year of the marriage. Income documentation, investment records, property management files. Organized by year, tabbed, in labeled folders. Crane had told her she was the most prepared client he had ever taken on an estate matter. He had meant it. He had also told her, at the end of that first meeting, that the records she had brought him were organized in a way that suggested she had been thinking about these things for a long time. She had said, "I manage events for a living. Preparation is not optional." He had laughed. He had remembered that exchange 6 years later when his paralegal said she knew exactly where everything was. Over 6 years, she had updated those files every year, without exception. She brought a new folder to his office each year. He filed everything. He had her full financial picture, current and historical, in a form that most attorneys only see in complex litigation cases. It was 7:18 in the morning when she reached him on his cell. She told him what the filing contained. She read him sections of the emergency motion. She described the assets listed and the timeline the other side appeared to be working with. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he said, "I have everything we need. Give me the day." She said, "I need a response filed before that freeze can go through." He said, "It will be done." She put her phone in her pocket. She stood in the parking lot for a minute. The morning light was coming over the roof of the venue, and the air was still cool, and she could hear, faintly, someone inside testing the audio system. A single note, adjusted, then another. The sound was ordinary, and she let it be ordinary. There was nothing to do right now except go back inside and be the person she needed to be for the next 12 hours. Crane was handling what needed to be handled. The wedding was what needed to be handled in this building, and she was the person who was going to handle it. She walked back through the service door and spent the next 12 hours being the mother of the bride. To understand what Crane did over the following hours, you have to understand what Margaret had given him over those 6 years. The estate planning documents were only the beginning. She had brought him her full financial picture in a form that was, even by the standards of thorough clients, exceptional. Her event planning business income going back to the year after the marriage, every contract, every payment record, every tax return. Her contributions to the family's investment portfolio, including records of every major decision she had been party to over 2 decades. And the commercial properties, both of them, both acquired during the marriage, both managed for the last 9 years entirely by Margaret. What that meant in practice was lease agreements, maintenance contracts, tenant correspondence, rent collection records, insurance filings, capital improvement decisions, and the annual tax filings for both properties. 9 years of that, every year updated, filed with Crane annually along with the rest. What she had given him was, in effect, a 22-year operational record of a woman who had managed every financial dimension of her family's life. Business income, investment decisions, real estate management, year by year, document by document. He spent the morning and early afternoon assembling the counterclaim response. His paralegal had been with him for 11 years and knew the client files nearly as well as he did. When he called her just before 8 in the morning and told her what had happened, she said, "Which client?" He told her. She said, "That one I know exactly where everything is." She was at the office by the time he arrived. They worked through the files, pulling the records that most directly addressed the emergency motion. The investment portfolio history, the commercial property management records, the documentation showing that the marital estate had grown substantially during the marriage, and that a measurable portion of that growth was directly connected to the management decisions Margaret had made. The business income records that established her financial contributions to the marriage from the beginning. The second open loop in this story is a quiet detail that matters. Crane had received Margaret's annual records update 8 months before the wedding. She had dropped off the folder on a Thursday morning without any particular conversation, just the annual update, same as every year. He had processed it and filed it and thought nothing more about it until the morning his phone rang at 7:18. 8 months later, those records formed the foundation of a same-day counterclaim that opposed an emergency asset freeze. The fact that the documents existed was not luck. The fact that they were current was not luck. Margaret had kept them current because she always kept them current. The other side had built their motion on the assumption that the records on the opposing side would be incomplete, outdated, or unavailable on the morning of a wedding. They were none of those things. The counterclaim response was, in Crane's later description, the clearest presentation of a spouse's financial contribution he had assembled in his career. Not because it was unusual in kind, but because it was complete. There were no gaps, no years where the record was thin, no properties that were documented by inference rather than direct evidence. Margaret had given him everything, and she had given it to him every year, and it was all there. He filed the response that afternoon, but go back, now, to the 6 months before that day, because the morning of the wedding was not the beginning of this story. It began earlier, with 3 things that Margaret noticed and, for different reasons, did not fully act on. 6 months before the wedding, Richard transferred his personal savings to a solo account. He mentioned it to Margaret one evening over dinner with the tone of a minor administrative announcement. He said he was simplifying his banking. He said it would be easier to keep track of things. Margaret had noted the joint account balance 2 or 3 weeks later and seen that it was lower than she would have expected. She logged it in the quiet internal record she kept for the household finances, a mental register alongside the physical one she maintained. She did not investigate further. She gave Richard the benefit of the doubt, which was not naivety. It was 22 years of accumulated trust. You do not dismantle that for a lower-than-expected balance on a Tuesday evening in September. She was managing a wedding. She was running her business. She had 3 active client files and a florist dispute and a hotel room block to renegotiate. She noted it and moved on. She was wrong to move on, but the mistake was Richard's, not hers. Trust is not a character flaw. She had been a faithful partner in managing the family's finances for 22 years. Richard had relied on that faithfulness while he was preparing to use it against her. The wrongness there was not Margaret's. 3 weeks before the wedding, their shared financial advisor, Glenn, who had worked with the family for 11 years, mentioned in passing to Margaret during a routine check-in call that Richard's attorney had placed a brief call to his office. Just a short conversation, nothing formal. Glenn had not been concerned about it. He assumed it was related to the estate planning that he knew Margaret and Richard had been loosely discussing, and he mentioned it the way you mention an administrative contact, in passing, as information, not a warning. Margaret heard it. She made a note. She attributed it to estate planning and moved on. She did not call Crane to mention it. She did not ask Richard about it. What that call actually was, Richard's attorney had been verifying the asset structure. He needed to confirm the composition of the marital estate before filing the emergency motion. He was mapping what was there, how it was held, and how it should be described in the legal language of a freeze request. Glenn had, unknowingly, provided confirmation of the portfolio's general structure in a brief professional exchange. The attorney had received that information months before the filing and had been building the motion since. What neither he nor Richard had ever asked was whether the records on the other side were already assembled. That question would have changed everything. It was the one question they did not ask. Greed gets loud when paperwork gets quiet. Richard's side had gotten very loud. A carefully timed filing, a precisely drafted emergency motion, a strategy built on the calculation that Margaret would be unreachable, distracted, and unprepared. What they had not asked was whether the paperwork was quiet. It was not. It had never been. The third signal came in the final week before the wedding, and this one, Margaret said, was the hardest to process later. Richard became unusually attentive. Not dramatically. There was no obvious shift in tone, nothing that would have registered to anyone else as unusual. He was simply more present than he normally was. He offered to help with vendor calls. He drove out twice to pick up materials that Margaret had arranged to collect herself. He sat with her while she went through the final timeline revisions and asked questions that showed he was paying attention. One evening they ate dinner together without tension, and he asked her about the ceremony and seemed genuinely interested in the answer. She had appreciated it. She had felt something toward him during those evenings that she described, later and carefully, as warmth she had not expected to feel. She understands now exactly what it was. He was managing the record. In the days before the filing, he needed his behavior to register as normal. If there were ever a question about the state of the marriage in the period immediately preceding the divorce papers, he needed nothing to stand out. He stayed close, he helped with practical tasks, he was present and kind. He was doing what Margaret had always done when she managed a complex event. looking ahead to how things would read later and making sure the picture was right. The kindness was a legal strategy. She says that is the thing she sat with the longest. Not the money, the kindness. Back to the morning of the wedding. After the call with Crane, Margaret walked back inside, and she did not tell a single person what was in her bag. Not her daughter, who was still asleep in the bridal suite, and whom Margaret had decided to protect from all of it, at least until after the honeymoon. Not Claire, not her sister, who was in the bridal party and who would have, with genuine good intentions, turned the day into a situation to be managed in a way that Margaret did not need. She carried it alone. She checked in with Crane twice by text during the morning preparation hours. He was working. She let him work. She moved through the day the way she moved through every event she had ever managed, by breaking it into its component parts and handling each one in order. The florist adjustment, the linen crew finishing the west side, the lighting final check, the catering team setup, the groomsman arriving in the wrong sequence and needing to be organized before the photography session, the pastry chef who appeared at Margaret's elbow around 2 o'clock to quietly notify her that one of the lower tiers had developed a slight lean during transport, and who had already set up a partition in the staging area to make the repair. Margaret looked at the cake, assessed the problem, said, "Fix it," and went back to the bridal suite to check on her daughter. All of it. She handled all of it. With the filing in her bag and Crane on the other side of town doing what she had asked him to do. At 2:45 in the afternoon, Crane sent her a text. 2 words. Filed it. She was standing in the hallway outside the bridal suite, 15 minutes before the ceremony was due to start. She read the message. She put her phone in her pocket. She went into the suite and told her daughter she looked exactly right. Her daughter was nervous, the good kind of nervous, and she asked Margaret if she thought everything was going to be fine. Margaret told her yes. She was not performing that answer. She meant it. There is a particular silence that settles in when you know something the other side does not yet know you know. It is not peace and it is not calm. It is the silence before the countermove, when the board is set and you are the only one who knows what position the pieces are in. Margaret had lived inside that silence all morning. When Crane's text came through, the silence changed quality. The countermove had been made. The freeze was opposed. The documents were before the court. The vendor invoices would be paid on Monday. The accounts were protected. What remained would take months to resolve, but the immediate threat was answered. She walked her daughter down the aisle, holding that knowledge entirely inside herself, and she was completely present for every second of it. The ceremony was at 3 in the afternoon. The walk from the staging area to the ceremony entrance takes about 90 seconds at a comfortable pace. Margaret had walked it twice during the rehearsal. She walked it again now, with her daughter's arm through hers, and she thought about nothing except the feel of her daughter's arm and the sound of the music starting and the faces of the guests turning toward them. She was not managing anything. She was just there. Margaret sat in the front row and she watched. Her daughter came down that aisle and Margaret held herself still and watched every step. Her new son-in-law was visibly overwhelmed in the way that genuinely happy people are overwhelmed, the kind of overwhelmed that is not performance. The vows were said. The room was quiet in that particular way that rooms full of people go quiet when something real is happening. Margaret did not cry, which surprised her afterward. She had expected to. Instead, she felt something she could only describe as steady. A steadiness that had been accumulating all day, through every vendor check and every timeline correction, and every moment she had held the filing in her bag without showing it to anyone. The reception began at 5. The transition from ceremony to cocktail hour went without interruption. Margaret had staged it carefully. The guests moved from the ceremony space to the terrace in 2 waves, guided by the ushers she had briefed the day before, And by the time the main doors to the reception hall opened, the florals were in place, the bar was running, and the lighting was exactly the color she had approved in the site visit 3 weeks earlier. That was the kind of detail that only matters to the person who planned it. No guest at that wedding would have noticed if the lighting had been slightly different. Margaret would have noticed. She had spent 14 months making decisions that the guests would never be aware of, and she had made them carefully anyway. Margaret moved through the room with the practiced ease of someone who had built the event and knew every corner of it. She spoke to guests. She handled the small corrections that Claire noted and brought to her. She made sure the timeline stayed on track. She checked that the band had the final setlist adjustment. She ate, briefly, near the kitchen entrance, a plate she had loaded quickly before the main service started. The toasts came. Her son-in-law's best man was funny and slightly self-deprecating, and the room laughed with him rather than at him, which is the harder thing to manage. Her daughter's best friend gave a toast that made 3 different tables cry. Margaret watched from the side of the room with the expression of a woman who had built this day and was watching it work. And then, sometime after the first dances had finished and the open dancing was fully underway and the room was alive and warm and loud in the best possible way, Margaret found a chair at the edge of the room near the door to the garden. She sat down for a few minutes, just to sit, just to watch. Her daughter was on the dance floor. The room was full of light and music and every person she cared about who was willing to celebrate this day. Her daughter was mid-laugh at something her husband had said, head back, completely present in her own happiness, and Margaret watched her from the edge of the room the way a person watches something they have worked hard to make possible. She thought about the year, not the divorce filing, not the freeze motion, not the proceedings that were coming. Just the year, the 14 months of work, the florist calls, and the venue walkthroughs, and the seating chart revisions, and the late nights going through vendor contracts, while the rest of the house was quiet. All of it had been moving toward this room, this evening, this particular moment of her daughter laughing in the light. The photograph in Margaret's jacket pocket, the one from her own wedding, the one that had traveled in her pocket all day, pressed gently against her when she leaned back in the chair. She thought about that photograph. She thought about who she had been in it. She thought about the 22 years between that day and this room. Not the financial records, not the accounts or the properties or the documents in Crane's files, but the actual shape of the life. The things she had built and managed and maintained, the events she had planned for other people, and the one she had planned for her own daughter. The mornings she had driven to the Millhaven property to meet a contractor, the evenings she had handled lease renewals at the kitchen table after dinner, the investment decisions, the tax filings, all of it, running through her as she watched her daughter dance, like a current she had not noticed until just now. Richard had watched her do all of that. He had been in the same house with her while she did it. He had watched her manage the paperwork, run the properties, build the business, maintain the portfolio. And he had concluded, somehow, from all of that evidence, that she was someone who could be outmaneuvered by a well-timed legal filing. He had observed her managing everything and concluded that managing everything was what would hold her in place. He did not know her at all. The dancing went until midnight. Margaret stayed until the end. She was the last non-vendor to leave, which was how she had always left events she had built. She walked through the space after the guests were gone, spoke briefly to the venue manager, confirmed the closing checklist, said goodnight to Claire, and walked out through the same loading dock where the morning had started. She stood in the parking lot for a moment. The air had gone cool, and the lot was almost empty, and behind her the venue was already quiet. She got in her car. She drove home. She thought she might fall apart on the way home. She had expected at some point in the day for the emotion to arrive and find her in a moment she could not contain. It never did. Not that night. She said later that there simply was no room for it. The day had been too full and too specific, and by the time she was alone in the car, the day was over, and what was coming next was going to take 8 months to resolve, and she was not going to spend the drive home dreading 8 months. She drove. She got home. She sat at the kitchen table for a while in the dark. She went to bed. The proceedings continued for 8 months after that day. Margaret described that period the same way she described the day of the wedding, by breaking it into its components and handling each one in order. There were depositions, there were document requests, there were sessions with Crane where they went through records for hours, preparing for arguments the other side would make. There were periods of waiting when nothing moved, and periods of activity when everything moved at once. There were moments when she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, a wearing down that comes from sustained conflict with someone you once trusted completely. Not because the conflict was loud, but because it required her to present her life as an accounting. Her 22 years on a balance sheet, her contributions weighed and calculated and argued over. She found that harder than she expected. Not the work itself. She was organized, she had Crane, she knew every record in the file. But the requirement to present what her marriage had been as a financial calculation was the part that cost her most. They were contested and slow and often exhausting. Richard's attorneys argued over asset characterization, over the proper weighting of each spouse's contributions, over how to treat the commercial properties in the division calculation. They challenged individual records. They questioned whether Margaret's management of the investment portfolio constituted a financial contribution or merely administrative support for decisions that Richard had been involved in initiating. Those arguments ran into the documentation every time. When the opposing counsel questioned whether Margaret had made specific investment decisions or merely been informed of them, Crane produced correspondence showing she had initiated those conversations directly. When they questioned whether her management of the commercial properties was substantive or nominal, Crane produced 9 years of maintenance records, lease negotiation correspondence, and contractor invoices bearing Margaret's signature. The documentation was complete because Margaret had made it complete, year by year, without any sense that she was preparing for litigation. She had been preparing the way a careful person prepares for everything, by keeping good records, because keeping good records is simply how you operate. The records did not create the truth about her contributions, they preserved it. The truth had existed for 22 years, accumulating through every decision she had made and every document she had filed, and every year she had walked into Crane's office with a folder that was exactly current. The records meant the truth survived contact with a proceeding designed to outrun it. The filing had been sealed longer than their patience lasted. Richard's team had planned their move over months, timed it with precision, and arrived at the morning of a wedding confident in the assumption that the documents on the other side were not ready. Every part of their strategy rested on that assumption. It was the only assumption that mattered. And it was wrong. The records Crane had filed the afternoon of the wedding were the foundation. Everything the other side challenged, the records answered. The investment portfolio? Years of documentation showing Margaret's role in every major decision. The commercial properties? 9 years of management records so complete that the opposing counsel, in a deposition, had asked whether Margaret had kept the records specifically in anticipation of litigation. She had not. She had kept them because she was the kind of person who kept things. That was all. There is a moment Crane described from the discovery phase. He and his paralegal were preparing for a deposition and had spread the full financial record across the conference table. Years of files, organized by date, exactly as Margaret had brought them. In the middle of the stack, included when Margaret had first come to him 6 years earlier as a reference anchor for the estate planning timeline, was the wedding photograph. The original, or a copy she had made for him. The photograph was there to establish a starting point. The marriage began here. Everything on this table came after that date. Crane looked at that photograph and then at the full 22-year record surrounding it, and he said later it was the clearest picture of a marital financial contribution he had ever laid out on a table. Not because the records were extraordinary in nature, but because they were complete. There were no gaps, no years that were thin on documentation, no properties that required reconstruction from secondary sources. A complete record, kept every year, because that was simply how Margaret operated. It was not quiet at all. The case did not settle quickly. The other side came in with offers that reflected a calculation about what Margaret would accept if the process went on long enough. She did not accept them. She had spent 22 years doing the work. She was not going to undervalue it now because someone was betting on her patience running out before theirs did. In the final stages of the proceedings, Richard's attorneys made an initial settlement offer that Crane advised was well below what the documentation supported. Margaret declined it. A second offer came 2 months later. Still short. A third offer 3 months after that. Crane told Margaret they could push further, that the record justified it. Margaret told him she wanted the outcome to be accurate. She did not need it to be punitive. She needed it to reflect what was true. 8 months after the wedding, the settlement was finalized. The court awarded Margaret 58% of the $6,200,000 marital estate. The investment accounts were divided accordingly. The Concord Street property and the Millhaven property were appraised with full recognition of Margaret's 9 years of management. The primary residence went to Margaret. The settlement reflected, as closely as these proceedings ever do, what the records had always shown. Richard had filed on the assumption that timing would win the case. A 3-day head start. The wedding preparation as cover. An emergency motion designed to move faster than she could respond. What he had not calculated was that the woman he had been married to for 22 years was the most organized person in every room she had ever been in. That her attorney had a complete financial record going back to the first year of the marriage, and that she was the kind of person who could read a divorce filing at a loading dock at 6 a.m, fold it back in half, and spend the next 12 hours doing exactly what her daughter needed her to do. He had watched her manage everything and concluded that managing everything was the thing that would hold her in place. He was wrong. Margaret keeps a photograph on her desk now. It is not the one from her own wedding, the one that traveled in her jacket pocket all day, pressed against her through the ceremony and the reception and the car ride home. The photograph on her desk is one taken at her daughter's wedding. Her daughter is in the center of the dance floor, the venue lit behind her, mid-laugh at something her husband has just said. Margaret is not in the frame. She was sitting at the edge of the room, near the door to the garden, watching from the chair she had found while the dancing was underway. She keeps that photograph there as a reminder of the day she did not fall apart. She says it is the best photograph that has ever been taken of her daughter. And she says that every time she looks at it, she also thinks about what it cost to be in that room on that specific day and stay composed. What it actually required, and what it meant about who she was. And she is glad she paid it. She does not call the outcome justice, the way people use that word when they mean punishment or vindication. She uses the word accuracy. The settlement was accurate. The records were accurate. The truth that had been accumulating for 22 years was accurate, and it survived a legal proceeding designed from the beginning to outrun it. The commercial properties, Concord Street and Millhaven, were appraised with full recognition of her 9 years of management, which meant the appreciation in value during those years was properly attributed. The investment accounts were divided based on the documented contribution history. The primary residence went to Margaret. The settlement, in every line of it, told the same story the records had always told. She had not needed to create that story in a courtroom. She had needed only to show that it had existed all along. Richard had believed that timing was the decisive factor. He had spent months building a strategy around it. The timing was real. He had 3 days on her. He had the wedding preparation as cover. He had an emergency motion designed to move before she could organize a response. What the timing could not account for was 22 years of organized documentation sitting in a file at her attorney's office, updated annually, complete in every single year. Timing matters when the other side is unprepared. Margaret had been preparing, without knowing she was preparing, for as long as the marriage had lasted. In the deposition, when opposing counsel asked her about her involvement in the investment portfolio decisions, she answered from memory and then cited the specific records she was drawing from. The deponent is allowed to reference documents during a deposition. She did not need to. She had it in her head. Crane said later that it was one of the more effective depositions he had witnessed, not because Margaret was combative, but because she was precise. Every question they asked, she answered with a specificity that made it clear she was not reconstructing her history from general impressions. She had lived it, recorded it, and she remembered it. She had been the one who kept things. She had always been the one who kept things. In the end, that was what the entire case turned on. Not strategy, not timing, not surprise. Records. And if stories like this remind you that the truth has a way of surviving, even when someone counts on you being too busy to fight back, subscribe to my channel for more stories. Because sometimes, the person who prepared quietly is the one who ends up standing. Have you ever been blindsided by a legal or financial action from someone you shared a home with, and had to choose between falling apart and keeping everything together for the people who needed you that day? Leave your answer in the comments. I read all of them.